The howling wind whipped across the dusty prairie as Rose Sullivan struggled to keep moving forward, her slender shoulders bent under the weight of her pack, and the precious burden she concealed beneath her tattered woolen shawl. It was 1875 in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming, and she was alone, completely alone, with miles of wilderness between her and salvation. Rose's breath came in ragged gasps as she trudged along the rutted trail. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, causing sweat to trickle down her dirt-smudged face. 3 days without proper rest had taken their toll, but stopping wasn't an option. Not with who she carried. "Just a little further, my sweet," she whispered, adjusting the bundle against her chest. The infant gave a soft whimper in response, reminding Rose why she couldn't surrender to the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. 6-month-old Emma was all she had left in this world, and Rose would crawl on bloodied hands and knees to keep her daughter safe. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance made her freeze. Frantically, Rose scanned the horizon, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been careful to cover her tracks, but Wallace Monroe had resources and determination. Her late husband's brother wouldn't stop until he found them, until he claimed the ranch that rightfully belonged to Emma, but the approaching rider wasn't Wallace. As the figure crested the hill, Rose saw a tall stranger astride a chestnut stallion. His broad shoulders were silhouetted against the setting sun, face shadowed beneath a worn leather hat. A cowboy, by the look of him, with a rifle secured to his saddle and a bandana pulled up against the dust. Rose clutched Emma tighter and stepped off the trail, seeking cover behind a large boulder. Her legs trembled, threatening to buckle beneath her. The sack of provisions slung across her back suddenly felt impossibly heavy, but she couldn't risk setting it down. Not when it contained all their worldly possessions and the precious deed to her husband's land. The rider slowed as he approached, his keen eyes scanning the landscape. Rose held her breath, praying Emma wouldn't cry out, but fate had other plans. The infant, uncomfortable in the heat and sensing her mother's anxiety, let out a pitiful wail that cut through the prairie silence. The cowboy reined his horse to a stop, turning toward the sound. "Hello," he called, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle. "Someone there?" Rose remained frozen, weighing her options. She could run, but not far or fast enough. She could hide, but Emma's cries would give them away. Fighting seemed futile. Her husband's revolver was buried at the bottom of her pack, and she doubted she had the strength to draw it, let alone aim. "I mean no harm," the man continued, dismounting with fluid grace. He lowered his bandana, revealing a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble. "Sounds like you've got a little one there." Something in his tone, a genuine concern rather than menace, made Rose step hesitantly from behind the boulder. "Stay back," she warned, her voice hoarse from thirst and fear. The cowboy stopped, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "Name's Zachary Parker. Most folks call me Zach." His eyes, a startling shade of blue against his sun-weathered skin, moved from Rose's face to the bundle in her arms, then to the heavy pack straining her shoulders. "You look like you're carrying more than you can hold, madam." "I'm managing fine," Rose lied, even as her knees threatened to buckle. Zach's expression softened. "No offense intended, but you don't look fine. You look about ready to collapse." He gestured to a cluster of cottonwood trees 100 yards off the trail. "I was fixing to make camp over yonder before nightfall. There's a creek for fresh water. You and your little one are welcome to share my fire." Rose hesitated. Every instinct told her to be wary of strange men in this lawless territory, but her body was betraying her. Her vision blurred at the edges, and Emma's weight in her arms seemed to multiply. "I don't need charity," she managed, pride still fighting despite her desperate situation. A hint of a smile touched Zach's lips. "Not offering charity, madam, just common decency." He took a cautious step forward. "At least let me carry some of that load. You look about ready to drop." As if his words had broken the last of her resolve, Rose swayed dangerously. Zach moved with surprising speed, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. One strong arm steadied her while the other gently relieved her of the heavy pack. "Easy now," he murmured, his calloused hand warm and sure against her elbow. The sudden lightening of her burden nearly brought tears to Rose's eyes. She blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to show further weakness. "Thank you," she said stiffly, adjusting Emma in her arms. The baby had quieted, her round eyes fixed curiously on the stranger. Zack nodded, slinging her pack over his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. "Cute little thing," he observed, peering at Emma. "What's her name?" Rose hesitated, still unsure how much to reveal. "Emma," she finally said. "Pretty name for a pretty girl." He smiled at the infant, then gestured toward the trees. "Camp's this way if you're of a mind to join me. Got coffee and some rabbit stew that's not half bad if I do say so myself." The mention of food made Rose's empty stomach clench painfully. When had she last eaten? Yesterday morning, perhaps, and just a few stale biscuits at that. She'd been saving what little remained for emergencies. "I suppose we could rest a while," she conceded, following as Zack led his horse toward the cottonwood grove. The campsite was better than Rose had expected. A small creek bubbled over smooth stones, providing fresh water and a natural barrier on one side. The cottonwoods offered shade and some protection from the wind, and a ring of stones suggested Zack had used this spot before. With practiced efficiency, he unsaddled his horse and set about building a fire. Rose sank gratefully onto a fallen log, cradling Emma against her chest. The baby was fussing again, hungry and uncomfortable. "She needs changing," Rose murmured, more to herself than to Zack. "And feeding." "There's clean water in the creek," Zack said without looking up from his task. "And I'll have this fire going in no time. You tend to your little one and I'll see about that stew." Grateful for his understanding, Rose retrieved a clean cloth from her pack and moved to the creek's edge. She bathed Emma carefully, murmuring soothing words as the infant squirmed and protested. The cool water revived them both, and by the time Rose had changed and fed her daughter, Zack had a respectable fire crackling and a pot of stew warming over the flames. "Hope you don't mind eating out of the same pot," he said, offering her a tin cup filled with steaming liquid. "I travel light." Rose accepted the cup with murmured thanks, settling Emma in her lap. The stew was simple rabbit, wild onions, and a few potatoes, but it was the most delicious thing she'd tasted in days. She forced herself to eat slowly, savoring each spoonful. As twilight deepened into night, the fire cast dancing shadows across the small camp. Emma had fallen asleep, her tiny face peaceful for the first time in days. Rose placed her gently on a makeshift bed of folded blankets, then returned to her seat by the fire. Zack studied her across the flames, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Mind if I ask where you're headed?" He finally asked. Rose stiffened. "West," she replied vaguely. "West covers a lot of territory," Zack observed, not unkindly, "and it's rough country for a woman alone with a baby." "I don't have much choice," Rose admitted, her gaze dropping to her sleeping daughter. Zack was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Running from something or someone, the direct question startled her. Rose looked up sharply, meeting his steady gaze. Something about those clear blue eyes made lies feel pointless. "Both," she said softly. Zack nodded as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Husband, dead," Rose replied flatly. 6 months ago. Fever took him 3 weeks after Emma was born." "I'm sorry for your loss," Zack said, and the simple sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. Rose swallowed hard. "Thank you. So if not your husband, then who are you running from?" "His brother," she admitted after a long pause. "Wallace wants my husband's ranch, says a woman can't manage it alone, especially not with a baby. He offered to buy it for a fraction of its worth." Her hands clenched in her lap. "When I refused, he tried to force me to marry him." Zack's expression darkened. "And you left rather than submit." "I had to," Rose whispered, glancing at Emma. "Wallace is a cruel man. I've seen how he treats his horses, his dogs, even his own workers. I couldn't let him near my daughter. And I couldn't let him steal what rightfully belongs to her." The deed to the ranch, Zach guessed, nodding toward her pack. That's what you're carrying. Rose stared at him, suddenly wary again. How did you know? Zach's lips quirked in a half-smile. Why else would you be struggling across open country with a heavy pack and a baby? Must be something mighty important in there. He leaned forward, his expression serious. Wallace he following you? I don't know, Rose admitted. I slipped out 3 nights ago while he was in town. Took what I could carry and headed west. I'm hoping to reach my cousin in Colorado territory. She and her husband have a place near Denver. That's a long way, Zach observed. At least another 2 weeks on foot if the weather holds. Rose lifted her chin. We'll make it. Zach studied her for a long moment, admiration flickering in his eyes. I believe you would at that, Mrs. Sullivan, she supplied after a brief hesitation. Rose Sullivan. Well, Mrs. Sullivan, I'm headed to Laramie myself. It's on your way to Denver. I'd be honored to offer you and little Emma an escort if you'd accept it. Rose regarded him cautiously. Why would you do that? You don't know me. I know enough, Zach replied. I know you're brave enough to strike out alone to protect your child. I know you're proud enough to resist help even when you desperately need it. His eyes crinkled at the corners. And I know that if you try to carry that pack and your baby for another 100 miles, you'll likely collapse before you're halfway there. Rose couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. You make a compelling argument, Mr. Parker. Zach, he corrected. And it's settled then. We'll head out at first light. He stood, stretching his tall frame. You take my bedroll, I'll keep watch for a spell. I couldn't, Rose began to protest. You could and you will, Zach interrupted firmly. You need proper rest more than I do. Besides, he added with a wink that transformed his serious face, that log you're sitting on is a far sight more comfortable than it looks. Too exhausted to argue further, Rose accepted his offer. The bedroll was worn but clean, smelling faintly of leather and pine. She settled beside Emma, one protective arm around her daughter. Mr. Parker, Zach, she called softly as he moved to tend the fire. Thank you. He turned, his face half in shadow. Sleep well, Rose Sullivan, he said quietly. You're safe tonight. And for the first time in months, Rose believed it might be true. Morning came with the cheerful chirping of meadowlarks and the soft nickering of Zach's horse. Rose woke feeling remarkably refreshed, despite the hard ground beneath the bedroll. Emma was already awake, contentedly gumming her tiny fist while Zach entertained her by dangling a piece of string adorned with a turkey feather. Hope you don't mind, he said when he noticed Rose watching. Little Miss here woke up about an hour ago, seemed ashamed to disturb your rest. Rose sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. You're good with her. Had a passel of younger siblings, Zach explained, gently tickling Emma's round belly. Learned early that babies are mostly looking for food, comfort, or entertainment. And which were you providing? Rose asked, amused by the serious way he was studying her daughter. Definitely entertainment, Zach replied with a grin. The other 2 are firmly in your territory, madam. Rose laughed, the sound surprising her. When had she last truly laughed? I appreciate the distinction, sir. Breakfast was a simple affair of coffee, jerky, and hardtack soaked in water to soften it for Emma. Afterward, Zach efficiently packed up the camp while Rose tended to her daughter. We'll make better time if you ride Thunder, Zach said, patting his chestnut stallion's flank. He's steady and strong enough to carry you both. And you? Rose asked, eyeing the large horse dubiously. I'll walk alongside, been in the saddle for 3 weeks straight. My legs could use the stretching, Rose hesitated. I don't know how to ride astride properly, she admitted. Not in a dress. Zach's eyes widened slightly, as if only now remembering she was a lady rather than just a fellow traveler. Of course. We can fashion a side saddle arrangement with some blankets. Not as comfortable for a long journey, but it'll do. With surprising ingenuity, Zach modified his saddle to accommodate Rose's modest needs. He then helped her mount, carefully handing Emma up once Rose was settled. Secure. He asked, his hands lingering briefly on her waist to ensure her balance. Rose nodded, oddly aware of the warmth of his touch through her thin dress. Yes, thank you. They set out as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. Zack led Thunder by the reins, setting a steady pace that ate up the miles without overtaxing either the horse or its riders. He seemed to have an instinctive knowledge of when to rest in the shade of a cottonwood or when to push on to reach a better water source. As they traveled, Rose found herself studying her unexpected companion. Zack Parker was not what she'd initially imagined. Beneath his weathered exterior was a thoughtful man with quick intelligence and unexpected gentleness. He spoke little of himself, deflecting personal questions with humor or changing the subject to their route or the surrounding landscape. By midday, they had covered more ground than Rose had managed in 2 full days of travel alone. They stopped near a small stream to water Thunder and rest in the shade. "We're making good time," Zack observed, offering Rose a strip of jerky. "Should reach Taylor's Creek by nightfall. There's a decent camping spot there, sheltered from the wind." Rose accepted the jerky with a grateful nod. "You know this area well." "Been riding these trails for about 5 years now," Zack replied, stretching his long legs out before him. "Started as a drover, then did some scouting for the Army. These days, I mostly work as a guide for folks heading west." "Is that what you're doing in Laramie?" "Meeting clients?" Something flickered in Zack's eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Something like that," he said vaguely. Rose didn't press. They all had secrets after all. Hers were bundled in her pack and cradled in her arms. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they moved west. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper. In the distance, the hazy outline of mountains rose against the horizon. "Beautiful country," Rose murmured, gazing at the rugged scenery. "That it is," Zack agreed, his voice soft with appreciation. "Wild and hard, but beautiful in its way." "Like its people," Rose observed. Zack glanced up at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You've got poetry in your soul, Rose Sullivan." She felt her cheeks warm. "Hardly. Just speaking truth as I see it." They reached Taylor's Creek as the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The camping spot Zack had mentioned was a small clearing nestled among a stand of pines, the bubbling creek providing both water and a pleasant backdrop of sound. As Zack tended to Thunder, Rose set about making a simple camp. She'd insisted on carrying her share of the work, despite Zack's protests that she was still recovering her strength. In truth, she felt better than she had in days, perhaps, because the crushing weight of solitary responsibility had been temporarily lifted from her shoulders. "Found some wild onions growing by the creek," Zack announced, returning with a handful of green shoots. "They'll go nice with the rabbit I snared this morning." "You caught a rabbit?" Rose asked, surprised. "When did you have time?" Zack winked. "Set the snare last night before we turned in. Checked it while you were feeding Emma this morning." "You're remarkably resourceful, Mr. Parker. Necessity breeds invention." Mrs. Sullivan. They worked together preparing the evening meal, moving around each other with an ease that belied their short acquaintance. Rose found herself enjoying the simple domesticity of it, chopping the wild onions while Zack tended the fire and prepared the rabbit. Emma lay on a blanket nearby, contentedly watching the dance of shadows on the pine branches above. After dinner, they sat by the fire, comfortable in each other's company. Emma had fallen asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. "How old were you when you married?" Zack asked suddenly, breaking the companionable silence. 18, Rose replied. Thomas was 26. We'd known each other since childhood. Our fathers were friends. Was it a good match? Rose considered the question. It was. Comfortable, she said finally. Thomas was kind, if not particularly passionate. He provided well and never raised his voice or his hand to me. She stroked Emma's soft cheek with one finger. He was overjoyed when I told him about the baby. Spent weeks building a cradle and making plans for the future. He sounds like a decent man, Zack observed. He was, Rose agreed. I miss him, though perhaps not in the way a widow should. We were partners more than lovers. She felt her cheeks flush at the admission. I'm sorry, that was inappropriate. No need for apologies, Zach said quietly. Truth is rarely inappropriate, just sometimes uncomfortable. Rose studied him across the fire. What about you? Have you ever been married? No, Zach replied, poking at the embers with a stick. Came close once. Girl named Catherine back in Missouri. Her father owned the general store where my mother bought supplies. What happened? A shadow crossed Zach's face. War happened. I joined up with the Union forces in '63. Wasn't even 18 yet, but I was tall and they didn't ask too many questions. By the time I made it back to Missouri in '65, Catherine had married a banker from St. Louis. I'm sorry, Rose said softly. Zach shrugged, his expression clearing. Turned out for the best. I wasn't the same boy who left, and she needed stability I couldn't give her. He glanced up at the star-filled sky. The war changed a lot of us, made it hard to settle. Is that why you came west? Partly, Zach admitted. Partly because there wasn't much left for me back home. Parents died during the war, fever took them both within a month of each other. Younger siblings got parceled out to relatives. His voice grew distant. Tried farming for a spell, but the soil felt like it was soaked in blood. Couldn't grow anything but nightmares. Rose's heart ached for the young man he must have been, returning from war only to find everything changed. And your siblings, do you see them? Right when I can. Lucy's married with 2 little ones in Kansas. Michael's working for the railroad in Utah Territory. The youngest 3 are still with my aunt in Illinois. A faint smile touched his lips. Send them money when work is steady, visit when I'm passing through. They're lucky to have you, Rose said. Zach's eyes met hers across the flames. Family's everything in this world. Blood or chosen doesn't much matter, it's who stands by you when times get hard. Rose nodded, thinking of her cousin in Colorado, the only family she had left besides Emma. Yes, she agreed softly, it is. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a welcome relief from the previous day's heat. They broke camp efficiently, falling into an easy rhythm together. By the time the sun had fully risen, they were already on the trail, Thunder carrying Rose and Emma while Zach walked alongside. The day passed pleasantly, with Zach pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his travels. Rose found herself laughing at his tales of misadventures with city folk unused to the rigors of Western life. This one banker from Boston, Zach recounted, insisted on bringing 3 trunks of clothing for a 2-week hunting expedition. Hired 6 pack mules just for his personal effects. First night out, a thunderstorm hit and spooked the mules. Last I saw of those trunks, they were bouncing down a ravine with the mules scattering in 6 different directions. Rose laughed, imagining the scene. What did the poor man do? Spent the next 2 weeks in the same set of clothes, growing increasingly ripe, Zach answered with a grin. Claimed it was embracing the frontier spirit by the end, though I notice he never booked another hunting trip. Their 3rd day together followed a similar pattern, with easy conversation interspersed with comfortable silences. Rose found herself sharing stories from her own life, her childhood on a small farm in Pennsylvania, her journey west with Thomas after their marriage, their struggles establishing the ranch in Wyoming Territory. Thomas had such dreams for that place, she said wistfully as they stopped to rest near a bubbling spring. 50 head of cattle to start, with plans to triple that within 5 years. A proper house to replace the cabin. Maybe even a small orchard, though everyone said fruit trees wouldn't survive the winters. Sounds like he was building for the future, Zach observed. For your future together. He was, Rose agreed, adjusting Emma in her lap. That's why I couldn't let Wallace have it. Not just because it's legally Emma's inheritance, but because it would dishonor everything Thomas worked for. Zach was quiet for a moment, absently rubbing Thunder's neck. This Wallace, he said finally. You think he's the type to come after you? Rose's stomach tightened at the question. Yes, she admitted. He's persistent and used to getting his way, dangerous, she hesitated. Not in the way of outlaws or gunslingers. He doesn't wear a gun or pick fights, but there's a coldness to him, a willingness to do whatever serves his interests, regardless of who gets hurt. The worst kind of dangerous, Zack muttered, his expression darkening. The kind that hides behind respectability. They traveled in silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts. By late afternoon, the landscape had changed significantly. They were entering more rugged terrain, with scattered pine forests and rocky outcroppings. In the distance, the mountains loomed larger, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the sunlight. "We'll camp early tonight," Zack announced as they approached a sheltered meadow beside a small, fast-flowing stream. "There's a settlement about 15 miles ahead, but we won't reach it before dark. Better to rest here and arrive fresh in the morning." Rose didn't argue. She was learning to trust Zack's judgment about their journey. He seemed to have an uncanny knack for finding the best camping spots, places with fresh water, natural shelter, and often some edible plants or game nearby. As they set up camp, Rose noticed Zack was unusually quiet, his usual easy manner replaced by a thoughtful solemnity. While she prepared their simple meal, he spent more time than usual checking their surroundings, climbing a nearby hill to survey the trail behind them. "Is something wrong?" she asked when he finally returned to the fire. Zack hesitated, then sat down beside her with a sigh. "Not sure," he admitted. "Thought I saw dust on the horizon earlier. Could be nothing, a deer herd or wild horses. Could be travelers on the same trail. Or it could be Wallace," Rose said, voicing the fear that had immediately sprung to her mind. "Possibly," Zack conceded. "But even if it is, we've got at least a day's lead. And once we reach Silver Creek tomorrow, there'll be people around. Harder for him to make trouble in a settlement." Rose nodded, but anxiety had already taken root in her chest. She glanced at Emma, peacefully sleeping on her blanket, and felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. "If he finds us, he won't get near you or Emma," Zack interrupted, his voice low and firm. "I promise you that, Rose." The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. For the first time, Rose glimpsed something hard and dangerous beneath Zack's easygoing exterior, a steel core that reminded her he was a man who had survived both war and the untamed frontier. "Thank you," she said softly. Their gazes held for a long moment before Zack looked away, clearing his throat. "Best get some rest," he said, rising to his feet. "I'll take first watch tonight." Despite her concern about possible pursuit, Rose slept surprisingly well. Perhaps it was the knowledge that Zack was keeping vigilant watch, or perhaps it was simple exhaustion catching up with her. Either way, when he gently shook her awake for her turn at watch, she felt remarkably refreshed. "All quiet," he reported, settling into the bedroll she had just vacated. "Wake me at first light." Rose nodded, moving to sit by the fire. The night was peaceful, with only the soft hooting of an owl and the gentle rustling of wind through the pines breaking the silence. She found herself studying Zack's sleeping form, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought him into her life just when she needed him most. 3 days ago, he had been a stranger, potentially threatening, definitely suspicious. Now, she trusted him with not only her safety but her daughter's as well. It was more than his strength or his skills that had earned that trust. It was the underlying decency she sensed in him, a fundamental goodness that all his gruff exterior couldn't hide. Dawn broke with a spectacular display of color, the eastern sky painted in shades of pink and gold. Rose was feeding Emma when Zack woke, sitting up in one fluid motion, immediately alert. "Morning," he greeted, running a hand through his tousled hair. "Everyone sleep well?" "Like a log," Rose replied with a smile. Though this little one decided dawn was the perfect time for breakfast, Zack chuckled, moving to rebuild the fire. "Smart girl, best time of day." They broke camp quickly, eager to reach Silver Creek before midday. The settlement, Zack explained, was little more than a trading post, a livery stable, and a handful of cabins, but it offered a chance to replenish their supplies and perhaps get news of the trail ahead. "Might be worth investing in a second horse if anyone's selling," Zach suggested as they set out. Make the journey to Denver easier. Rose frowned. I don't have much money, she admitted. Just what I could take from the household funds before I left. We'll figure something out, Zach assured her. Maybe trade some of my gear. I've got a good rifle that would fetch a fair price. I couldn't ask you to do that, Rose protested. Zach shrugged. You didn't ask, I offered. Besides, a rifle's just a tool, can always get another. Rose studied his profile, touched by his casual generosity. You're a good man, Zachary Parker. He glanced at her, a hint of color rising in his tanned cheeks. Don't go spreading that around, ruin my reputation as a tough trailsman. Rose laughed, the sound bright in the morning air. Your secret is safe with me. They reached Silver Creek just before noon, the small settlement bustling with more activity than Rose had expected. A wagon train had stopped for supplies, filling the single dusty street with oxen, horses, and travel-weary families. Perfect timing, Zach observed as they approached. With this many folks passing through, Wallace would have a hard time spotting us even if he has tracked us this far. They made their way to the trading post, where Zach helped Rose dismount before tying Thunder to the hitching rail. Inside, the store was crowded with pioneers stocking up for the journey west. Rose, with Emma on her hip, browsed the limited selection of baby goods while Zach inquired about horses for sale. No luck, he reported when he rejoined her. Nobody selling. But the storekeeper says there's a widow at the edge of town who might be willing to part with her late husband's mare. Thought we might check after we've had something to eat. The mention of food reminded Rose how hungry she was. They purchased simple provisions, bread, cheese, and dried apples, and found a quiet spot behind the trading post to enjoy their meal. I was thinking, Zach said as they ate, it might be wise to join that wagon train for a spell. They're headed to Fort Laramie, which is on our way. Safety in numbers. Rose considered the suggestion. Wouldn't that slow us down? Wagon trains move at a crawl compared to riders. True, Zach acknowledged. But they're well armed and there's always folks willing to help with little ones. He nodded toward Emma, who was contentedly gumming a piece of dried apple. Might give you a chance to rest properly. Before Rose could respond, a commotion from the front of the trading post caught their attention. Raised voices, then the sound of a scuffle. Zach was on his feet instantly, motioning for Rose to stay put as he moved to investigate. He returned moments later, his expression grim. We need to go now. What is it? Rose asked, alarmed by the urgency in his voice. Wallace, Zach replied tersely. Just rode in with 2 men. They're asking about a woman traveling with a baby. Rose's blood ran cold. She clutched Emma tighter, looking frantically around for an escape route. How did he find us so quickly? Questions later, Zach said, helping her to her feet. Right now, we need to disappear. There's a back door through the storeroom. I'll get Thunder and meet you behind the livery stable. Stay out of sight. Heart pounding, Rose slipped through the crowded storeroom and out the rear door, keeping Emma close to her chest. The baby, sensing her mother's tension, remained mercifully quiet as Rose made her way cautiously between buildings, avoiding the main street. The livery stable stood at the far end of the settlement, with an open area behind it where horses were exercised. Rose pressed herself against the weathered boards of the stable, straining to hear any sound of pursuit over the drumming of her own pulse. Minutes passed like hours before she heard the soft nicker of a horse approaching. She tensed, ready to flee, but then Zach appeared, leading Thunder by the reins. His face was tight with tension. They're searching the wagon train, he reported in a low voice, quickly helping Rose mount. Won't take them long to realize we're not with them. We need to be gone before they start checking the outlying buildings. Where will we go? Rose asked as Zach swung up behind her, his chest solid and warm against her back. There's a trail through the foothills, he replied, urging Thunder into a trot away from the settlement. Not well traveled. Leads to an old trapper's cabin, I know. We can lay low there until it's safe to move on. They rode hard for over an hour, following a narrow path that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. Thunder, despite carrying double, maintained a steady pace, his powerful muscles working tirelessly beneath them. Emma, secured in a sling across Rose's chest, slept through most of the journey, lulled by the rhythmic motion. Rose was intensely aware of Zach's proximity, his arms around her as he held the reins, his breath warm against her ear when he leaned forward to point out the trail. Despite the danger of their situation, she found herself drawing comfort from his solid presence. The trapper's cabin was well hidden in a small valley, nestled among pines and protected by steep ridges on 3 sides. A spring bubbled from rocks nearby, creating a small, clear pool before meandering away as a stream. The cabin itself was crude but sturdy, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a single window covered by a wooden shutter. "Not exactly the Palmer House Hotel," Zach remarked as he helped Rose dismount, "but it'll serve our purpose." Inside, the cabin was surprisingly clean if sparsely furnished. A plank table with 2 mismatched chairs, a narrow cot against one wall, and a stone fireplace with a cast iron pot hanging from a hook. Shelves along one wall held an assortment of traps, tools, and supplies. "Trappers maintain a code," Zach explained, seeing Rose's surprise at the well-stocked shelves. "Leave the cabin as you found it, replace what you use if you can, and always leave dry firewood for the next visitor." "Sensible," Rose observed, settling Emma on a folded blanket while she explored their temporary refuge. "How long do you think we'll need to stay?" Zach frowned, moving to the window to survey their surroundings. "Hard to say. Depends on whether Wallace picks up our trail. Even if he does, this place is difficult to find unless you know it's here." He turned back to Rose, his expression softening. "Try not to worry, we're safe for now." As evening approached, they settled into a domestic routine that was becoming familiar. Zach tended to Thunder and gathered firewood while Rose prepared a simple meal from their supplies. Emma, delighted with her new surroundings, practiced rolling over on the cabin floor, gurgling happily when she succeeded. After dinner, they sat before the fire, the dancing flames casting a warm glow over the rustic interior. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, pattering softly on the cabin's wooden roof. "Perfect timing," Zach observed, sipping from a tin cup of coffee. "Rain will wash away any tracks we left." Rose nodded, glancing at Emma, who had finally succumbed to sleep on the cot. "I can't thank you enough for all you've done," she said quietly. "You've put yourself at considerable risk for us." Zach's eyes met hers across the small space. "No thanks needed. Couldn't rightly call myself a man if I'd left you and that little one to fend for yourselves." "Still," Rose insisted, "many would have. You could have simply pointed me toward Silver Creek and continued on your way. Your business in Laramie must be important." Something flickered in Zach's expression, a hesitation quickly masked. "Laramie can wait," he said simply. Rose studied him in the firelight, curiosity overcoming propriety. "What is it that draws you there, if you don't mind my asking?" Zach was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. Just when Rose thought he wouldn't answer, he spoke, his voice low. "There's a man there, name's Frank Winslow, runs a saloon called the Silver Dollar." "A friend?" Rose prompted when he fell silent again. "No," Zach replied, a hardness entering his tone. "Not a friend, he's the man who killed my brother." Rose drew in a sharp breath. "Oh, Zach, I'm so sorry." "Happened 2 years ago," Zach continued, still staring into the fire. "James was just 19, working as a ranch hand outside Laramie. Good kid, never looked for trouble." His hand tightened on his coffee cup. "Story I heard is that he won a few dollars in a card game at the Silver Dollar. Winslow accused him of cheating, though everyone knew James couldn't bluff to save his life." Zach's voice grew tight. Words were exchanged. "James turned to leave. Winslow shot him in the back." "That's murder," Rose whispered. "Should have been," Zach agreed grimly. "But Winslow has connections in Laramie. Territorial judge is his wife's uncle. Case never even went to trial." He finally looked up, meeting Rose's gaze. "I was guiding a party in Montana when it happened. By the time word reached me, James was buried and Winslow was back behind his bar like nothing had happened. Understanding dawned on Rose with a cold clarity. You're going to Larry me to confront him. It wasn't a question, but Zach nodded anyway. Man needs to answer for what he did. Zach, Rose said carefully, what exactly do you intend to do? He was silent for a long moment. I don't know, he finally admitted. Part of me wants to call him out, make him face me man to man. Eye for an eye, his voice dropped. But that's not who I am, not who my parents raised me to be, not who James would want me to become. Then why go at all? Rose asked gently. Because I need to look him in the eye, Zach replied. Need him to know that James had family who loved him. That his life mattered. He set his cup down with deliberate care. And I need to decide once and for all if I'm the kind of man who can walk away from vengeance. Rose reached across the small space between them, placing her hand over his. I think you already know what kind of man you are, Zachary Parker. I've seen it every day since we met. Zach looked down at their joined hands, then slowly turned his palm upward, his fingers curling around hers. Maybe, he said softly, but knowing and doing can be different things. They sat in silence after that, hands linked in the firelight, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean. The storm continued through the night and into the following day, keeping them confined to the cabin. Rose found herself grateful for the enforced pause in their journey. The past weeks had been a constant strain of fear and vigilance, first at the ranch with Wallace's increasing pressure, then during her desperate flight. Even with Zach's help, the pace of their travel had allowed little true rest. The cabin, despite its rustic simplicity, offered a sense of security she hadn't felt since Thomas's death. Perhaps it was the solid walls and remote location, or perhaps it was the man who shared the space with her steady, capable, and increasingly dear. They passed the day in quiet domesticity. Zach repaired a loose shutter and patched a leak in the roof, while Rose organized their supplies and washed their travel-worn clothing in the spring's clear water. Emma, delighted with the novel surroundings, explored the cabin floor, practicing her newfound rolling skills and attempting to pull herself up on the furniture. She's determined, Zach observed, watching as Emma struggled to grip the edge of a chair. Going to be walking before you know it. Rose smiled, pride warming her heart. She's like her father that way. Thomas never gave up on anything once he set his mind to it. Good quality to have out here, Zach commented, moving to help Rose hang their wet clothing near the fire to dry. Takes grit to build something from nothing. Is that what you want someday? Rose asked. To build something of your own, Zach considered the question, his expression thoughtful. Used to dream of it, a piece of land, maybe a small herd, simple cabin to start with room to expand. He shrugged. War changed things. Found it hard to stay in one place afterward. Always felt like I needed to keep moving. And now, Rose prompted gently, his eyes met hers, something warm and uncertain in their blue depths. Now I'm starting to remember why putting down roots might be worth the risk. The simple statement hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks and busied herself with straightening the already neat pile of supplies. By evening, the rain had finally stopped, though water still dripped from the pines surrounding the cabin. Zach ventured out to check their surroundings, returning with a brace of rabbits for their dinner. No sign of pursuit, he reported as he set about preparing the game. If Wallace followed us from Silver Creek, he's lost the trail in the rain. Relief washed through Rose. So we're safe, for now, Zach agreed, but we should still be cautious when we move on. Wallace strikes me as the persistent type. He is, Rose confirmed, her momentary relief dimming. He's wanted the ranch since before Thomas died. Used to drop hints about how a woman couldn't manage such a property alone, even when Thomas was still alive. Vulture, Zach muttered, his knife moving deftly as he cleaned the rabbits, waiting for his chance. Rose sighed, absently stroking Emma's soft hair as the baby dozed in her lap. The worst part is that he was right, in a way. I couldn't manage the ranch alone, not with Emma so young, not without help. If circumstances had been different, I might have considered selling." Her expression hardened. "But not to him, never to him." "What will you do once you reach your cousin in Denver?" Zach asked. "Sell the ranch to someone else, eventually, perhaps," Rose admitted. "But not immediately. The deed stays in trust for Emma until she's of age. Thomas was explicit about that in his will." She smiled faintly. He always said land was the only thing they weren't making more of, wanted to make sure Emma had options when she grew up. Zach nodded approvingly. "Smart man, your husband." "He was," Rose agreed softly. "Not perfect, but good and decent. Emma and I were fortunate." She looked up, meeting Zach's gaze. "And fortunate again to have found you." Something shifted in Zach's expression, a softening, a vulnerability he rarely allowed to show. "Think it might be the other way around, Rose Sullivan." The quiet intimacy of the moment was broken by Emma's sudden fussing. Rose turned her attention to her daughter, but the connection between them lingered, like a thread drawn taut across the small cabin. That night, Rose insisted Zach take the cot while she and Emma slept on a pallet of blankets by the fire. He protested, but Rose was firm. "You've been sleeping on the ground for days because of us," she pointed out. "Your back must be aching something fierce." "I've had worse," Zach argued, though he couldn't quite hide a wince as he stretched. "Exactly my point," Rose said triumphantly. "Take the cot, Zachary Parker, that's final." He raised his hands in surrender, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, madam, no sense arguing with a determined woman." Despite the hard floor, Rose slept well. Comforted by the familiar sounds of the cabin, the occasional pop from the banked fire, Emma's soft breathing, and the reassuring presence of Zach nearby. She woke once in the night to find him standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the shutter slats. He turned as if sensing her gaze, offering a nod of reassurance before returning to his vigil. Morning brought clear skies and the decision to resume their journey. "If we leave at first light tomorrow, we can reach the main trail by midday," Zach explained as they shared breakfast. "From there, it's 3 days to Laramie, then another week or so to Denver, depending on the weather and our pace." Rose nodded, both relieved and oddly reluctant. Their time in the cabin had been a strange interlude, a pause in their flight, a moment of peace before facing the world again. Part of her wished it could last longer. They spent the day preparing for departure, checking their supplies, repairing gear, and ensuring everything was ready for an early start. Zach taught Rose how to load and fire Thomas's revolver, his hands steady and patient as he guided her through the process. "Hope you never need to use it," he said as she practiced aiming at a knot in the cabin wall. "But better to know how and not need to than need to and not know how." By afternoon, their preparations were complete. Zach suggested a short walk to stretch their legs before the journey ahead, and Rose readily agreed. Emma, secured in her sling, gurgled happily as they strolled along the small stream that flowed past the cabin. The day was perfect warm sunshine tempered by a cool breeze, the air fragrant with pine and wildflowers. They walked in companionable silence for a time, simply enjoying the peaceful surroundings. "Thomas and I used to dream of having a place like this," Rose said finally, gesturing to the secluded valley. "Somewhere quiet away from the main trails, room for Emma to run and play without worrying about raiders or rustlers." Zach nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Hard to find that kind of peace these days, territories filling up fast." "Too fast, sometimes," Rose agreed. "Thomas used to say progress was like a buffalo stampede, unstoppable and likely to trample you if you didn't move with it," Zach chuckled. "Wise man." They had reached a small clearing where the stream widened into a shallow pool. Wildflowers dotted the grassy banks, adding splashes of color to the verdant scene. Rose settled on a sun-warmed rock, adjusting Emma in her lap. "May I?" Zach asked, holding out his arms for the baby. Rose handed Emma over, watching as he cradled her with surprising gentleness. Emma immediately reached for his beard, fascinated by the rough texture. "Careful there, little lady," Zach warned with a laugh. "That's attached." Rose smiled, enjoying the sight of her daughter's obvious delight in Zach's attention. "She likes you." "Feelings mutual," Zach replied, carefully freeing his beard from Emma's determined grip. He looked up, his eyes meeting Rose's. "She's got her mother's spirit, stubborn and brave." Heat rose in Rose's cheeks at the admiration in his gaze. "I'm not brave," she protested. "Just doing what needs doing." "That's what bravery is," Zach countered. "Facing what needs facing even when you're scared." He bounced Emma gently, making her giggle. "Your mama's one of the bravest people I've ever met, Miss Emma. Don't let her tell you different." Rose laughed, embarrassed but pleased by his praise. "You're too kind, sir." "Not kind," Zach corrected. "Just honest." Something in his tone made Rose look up sharply. Their gazes locked, and the air between them seemed to change, becoming charged with unspoken possibilities. Emma chose that moment to let out a demanding squeal, breaking the tension. "Someone's hungry," Zach observed, handing the baby back to Rose. "She's always hungry," Rose replied with a smile, grateful for the diversion. "Growing girl." They made their way back to the cabin, the moment passed but not forgotten. That evening, as they shared a final meal before tomorrow's departure, conversation flowed easily between them, touching on childhood memories, favorite books, and hopes for the future. "My mother loved poetry," Rose confessed as they sat before the fire. "Used to read Wordsworth and Keats aloud while she mended clothes. I can still recite Ode to a Nightingale from memory." "Let's hear it then," Zach encouraged, leaning back in his chair. Rose hesitated, then began to recite, her voice soft in the quiet cabin. "My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk." As the beautiful words filled the small space, Zach watched her with undisguised admiration. When she finished, he remained silent for a moment, as if reluctant to break the spell her voice had cast. "That was beautiful," he finally said. "You've got a gift for it." "Hardly," Rose demurred, "but thank you. It reminds me of home of my mother in simpler times." "Do you miss it?" "Pennsylvania," Rose considered the question. "Sometimes I miss the green hills and the changing seasons." The sense of history in the old stone buildings. She glanced around the cabin. "But there's something about the West that gets under your skin, the openness, the possibility." "Freedom," Zach suggested. "Yes," Rose agreed. "Freedom, despite all the dangers and hardships." They fell silent, each contemplating the strange paths that had led them to this moment, sharing a quiet evening in a remote cabin, their lives temporarily entwined by circumstance and growing affection. "We should get some rest," Zach finally said, rising to bank the fire. "Early start tomorrow." Rose nodded, gathering the sleeping Emma in her arms. Tonight, she didn't argue when Zach insisted she take the cot. The pallet by the fire had left her with a stiff back and shoulders, though she'd never have admitted it. As she settled Emma beside her on the narrow cot, Rose found herself reluctant for this day to end. Tomorrow would bring a return to the trail, to danger and uncertainty. But it would also bring them closer to their destinations, Zach to his confrontation in Laramie, Rose to her cousin in Denver. And then what? The question haunted her as she drifted toward sleep. What happened when their paths inevitably diverged? Dawn broke crisp and clear, the eastern sky painted in shades of gold and amber. They departed the cabin as planned, leaving it clean and well-stocked for the next traveler who might seek its shelter. Zach had insisted on leaving extra supplies, coffee, salt, and jerky as thanks for the refuge it had provided. "Trail magic," he explained when Rose questioned the generosity. "What goes around comes around out here. Might save someone's life someday." They traveled cautiously, Zach frequently stopping to check their back trail and scout the path ahead. By midday, they had reached the main trail without incident, and some of the tension left Zach's shoulders. "We'll make better time from here," he said as they paused to rest and water thunder. "Trail's well traveled. Should reach Miller's Crossing by nightfall, small settlement with an actual inn, Might be nice to sleep in a real bed for a change. Rose couldn't deny the appeal of that prospect. As comfortable as the trapper's cabin had been compared to sleeping rough, the thought of clean sheets and a proper mattress was tantalizing. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the terrain gradually flattening as they moved away from the foothills. The trail widened, showing signs of regular travel wagon ruts, hoofprints, and occasional debris left by passing travelers. Rose noticed Zach growing increasingly vigilant as they approached Miller's Crossing. He scanned each rise and bend in the trail with narrowed eyes, one hand never far from the rifle secured to his saddle. "You're worried," she observed quietly. Zach glanced back at her, then returned his attention to the trail ahead. "Just cautious. Settlements mean people, people mean talk." If Wallace has been asking questions, word might have spread. The reminder of their pursuer sent a chill through Rose. For a few precious days at the cabin, she had almost forgotten the danger that had set her on this path. Almost, but not quite, it lurked at the edges of her thoughts, a shadow that never fully receded. Miller's Crossing appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. It was larger than Silver Creek, a proper settlement with a main street lined with wooden buildings, including a church with a small steeple. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sounds of civilization voices hammering, the lowing of cattle carried on the evening breeze. "We'll skirt around to the back of the inn," Zach decided as they approached. "Less chance of being noticed that way." The Red Deer Inn stood at the far end of the main street, a two-story structure with a wide porch and hitching rails out front. As planned, they circled behind the buildings, approaching the inn from the rear where a small stable provided shelter for guests' horses. A gangly young man of perhaps 16 emerged from the stable as they arrived, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "Evening, folks. Need a stall for your horse, if you've got one available," Zach replied, dismounting before helping Rose and Emma down, "and a room for the night." "Got both," the boy confirmed, eyeing Thunder with admiration. "Fine animal you got there, mister." Zach handed over the reins with a nod. "Treat him well, and there's an extra dime in it for you." The boy's face lit up. "Yes, sir, I'll give him the best stall we got." Inside, the inn was clean and modestly appointed. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes greeted them from behind a small desk in the entryway. "Welcome to the Red Deer," she said warmly. "I'm Martha Kane. My husband and I own this establishment." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Kane," Zach replied. "We're looking for a room for the night, my wife, daughter, and myself." Rose felt a jolt of surprise at Zach's casual lie, but quickly schooled her features into a pleasant smile. Of course, a married couple with a child would attract far less attention than a single woman traveling with an unrelated man. "Of course," Mrs. Kane said, opening a ledger on the desk. "We have a nice room on the second floor with a proper bed, $2 for the night including breakfast." "That'll do fine," Zach agreed, counting out the money from his wallet. "Name for the register?" Mrs. Kane asked, dipping her pen in ink. "Parker," Zach replied without hesitation. "Zachary and Rose Parker," Mrs. Kane nodded, recording the information. "Traveling far, Mr. Parker?" "Denver," Zach answered smoothly. "Visiting my wife's family." "Long journey with a little one," Mrs. Kane observed, smiling at Emma, who was studying the new surroundings with wide eyes. "How old is she?" "6 months," Rose replied, finding her voice. "She's a good traveler, thankfully." Mrs. Kane handed Zach a key. "Room 5, top of the stairs and to your right. Supper's served until 8 in the dining room. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and plentiful." They thanked her and made their way upstairs. The room was simple but clean: a double bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a small table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair by the window. After days on the trail and nights in the cabin, it seemed positively luxurious. "I can sleep on the floor," Zach said immediately, setting their packs down, "or see if they have another room available." Rose shook her head. "No need to draw attention with unusual requests. The bed is large enough." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. We're both adults. We can manage for one night. Zach looked relieved, whether at her practical approach or at not having to sleep on another hard floor. Rose couldn't tell. I'll fetch water for washing up, he offered. You and Emma get settled. When he returned with a steaming pitcher, Rose had changed Emma's clothing and was attempting to freshen her own appearance with a small hairbrush from her pack. Her golden brown hair, usually neatly pinned, had come loose during their journey and now hung in waves past her shoulders. Never seen your hair down before, Zach observed, setting the pitcher on the washstand. It's pretty. Rose's hands stilled in their task. Thank you, she said softly, unexpectedly pleased by the simple compliment. They took turns washing away the dust of travel, then made their way downstairs for supper. The dining room was half full, mostly with local residents rather than travelers. A few curious glances came their way, but most diners were too absorbed in their meals and conversations to pay them much attention. The food was simple but delicious: roast beef, mashed potatoes, and fresh bread with butter. Rose hadn't realized how hungry she was until the plate was set before her. Emma, perched on her lap, reached eagerly for the soft bread. Slow down, little one, Rose laughed, breaking off a tiny piece for her daughter to gum. Your first taste of Mrs. Kane's cooking. Good appetite, observed an elderly man at the next table. Growing like a weed, I'd wager. That she is, Zach replied with an easy smile. Keeping her mama busy day and night, the old man nodded approvingly. Children are a blessing, raised 5 myself. He winked at Emma, who stared back solemnly before breaking into a gummy smile. Got a charmer there. She comes by it honestly, Zach said, his eyes meeting Rose's across the table. Takes after her mother. Rose felt warmth bloom in her chest at the tender look in his eyes. For a moment, she could almost believe they were truly what they pretended to be: a young family traveling together, bound by love and shared purpose. After dinner, they returned to their room, the comfortable domesticity continuing as they prepared for sleep. Rose nursed Emma while seated in the rocking chair, a shawl draped modestly over her shoulder. Zach busied himself checking their gear and planning the next day's journey, carefully avoiding looking in her direction. Once Emma was asleep, Rose placed her in the middle of the bed, building a barrier of pillows to prevent her from rolling off. She then faced the awkward task of preparing for bed herself. I'll step out, Zach offered, sensing her discomfort. Give you privacy to change. Thank you, Rose said gratefully. When he returned a few minutes later, Rose was already in bed, the covers pulled up to her chin. She had changed into her nightgown, the only one she'd managed to pack in her hasty departure from the ranch. It was modest enough, high-necked and long-sleeved, but still more intimate attire than Zach had seen her in. He moved to the far side of the bed, removing his boots and outer shirt but remaining in his trousers and undershirt. This all right? He asked, gesturing to the arrangement. It's fine, Rose assured him, careful to keep her voice low to avoid waking Emma. Thank you for being a gentleman. Zach smiled faintly as he stretched out on top of the quilt, leaving the sheet and blanket for Rose. My mother would haunt me if I were anything less. They lay in silence for a time, the only sounds Emma's soft breathing and the occasional creak of the inn's timber frame settling for the night. Rose was acutely aware of Zach's presence beside her, the warmth radiating from his body, the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to him. Zach. She whispered finally. I've been thinking about what you said, about Laramie and Frank Winslow. He turned his head toward her, his profile visible in the dim light filtering through the curtains. What about it? Rose hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I understand wanting justice for your brother. Truly I do, but you're worried I'm planning to get myself killed, Zach finished for her, or worse, Rose admitted, that you might do something you'll regret for the rest of your life. Zach was quiet for a long moment. Been thinking about that myself, he finally said, especially these past few days. And, Rose prompted gently, he sighed, the sound heavy in the quiet room, And I'm not sure anymore. For 2 years it's been so clear in my mind, find Winslow, make him pay. Simple as that. His voice dropped lower. Now nothing seems simple. Rose shifted slightly, turning to face him more fully. What changed? Zach's eyes found hers in the darkness. You, he said simply. You and Emma. The admission hung between them, fraught with implications neither was ready to voice. Rose's heart beat faster and she found herself struggling for words. Whatever you decide, she said finally, just promise me you'll be careful, Emma and I. She swallowed hard. We've grown rather fond of you, Zachary Parker. His hand found hers atop the quilt, his fingers warm as they entwined with hers. I've grown rather fond of you too, Rose Sullivan. He squeezed her hand gently. Get some sleep now, long day ahead tomorrow. Rose closed her eyes, Zach's hand still holding hers. Despite the uncertainty of their future, she felt strangely at peace. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Morning came with the cheerful sounds of a settlement awakening, wagon wheels on the street below, voices calling greetings, a rooster crowing somewhere nearby. Rose woke to find Zach already up and dressed, standing by the window with Emma in his arms. He was pointing out sights to the baby, his deep voice a soothing rumble as he narrated the activities below. And there's the blacksmith opening his forge. See the smoke from his fire. He'll be shoeing horses and fixing wagon wheels all day long. Emma gurgled in response, clearly delighted with both her elevated perch and her attentive companion. Zach turned at the sound of Rose stirring, a smile warming his features. Morning, he greeted. Hope we didn't wake you. Miss Emma here was getting restless and I thought I'd give you a few more minutes of sleep. Rose sat up, combing her fingers through her loose hair. That was thoughtful, thank you. She smiled at her daughter. Has she been behaving herself? Perfect lady, Zach assured her, bouncing Emma gently. We've been having a fine conversation about the town and its inhabitants. The domestic scene tugged at Rose's heart, this good man holding her child with such natural ease, the morning light illuminating them both. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different reality, one where Zach was truly Emma's father, where they were a real family bound by love rather than circumstance. The fantasy was both sweet and painful, a glimpse of something she hadn't realized she wanted until this moment. After breakfast, hearty portions of flapjacks, bacon, and eggs provided by the inn, they prepared to depart. Mrs. Kane furnished them with fresh supplies for their journey, including a small jar of applesauce for Emma that she insisted was on the house. Safe travels to Denver, the innkeeper said warmly as they took their leave. If you pass back this way, the Red Deer will welcome you again. They were mounting Thunder behind the inn when the stable boy from the previous evening came running up, his young face flushed with excitement. Mr. Parker, sir, glad I caught you before you left. What is it, son? Zach asked, instantly alert. The boy glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. Overheard something you might want to know. 3 men rode in early this morning asking questions about a woman with a baby. One of them was real insistent older fellow with gray at his temples, fancy vest with a silver watch chain. Rose felt her blood run cold. The description matched Wallace perfectly. Where are they now? Zach asked, his voice calm despite the tension Rose could see in his shoulders. Over at the saloon, the boy replied. Offering money for information, said they're looking for the man's sister-in-law who ran off with his niece. He frowned. That true, sir? No, Zach said firmly. It's not. Thank you for the warning. There's $1 for your trouble. He pressed the coin into the boy's hand. Now, which way is the saloon from here? North end of town, the boy answered, pocketing the money. But you'd be riding right past it if you take the main street. Zach nodded, considering their options. Is there another way out of town? Preferably without being seen, the boy thought for a moment. There's the old creek trail behind the livery. Leads northwest, eventually joins up with the main trail about 5 miles out, bit rough in places but passable. That'll do, Zach decided, helping Rose mount before swinging up behind her. Much obliged for your help. "Godspeed, sir," the boy said, stepping back as Thunder danced impatiently. "Madam," they followed the boy's directions, slipping away from Miller's Crossing via the narrow creek trail. The path was indeed rough, winding through dense underbrush and crossing the shallow creek several times. Thunder picked his way carefully, seeming to understand the need for quiet progress. Once they were well away from the settlement, Zack urged the horse to a faster pace. They traveled in tense silence for nearly an hour before Rose finally spoke. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Zack's arms tightened briefly around her waist. "Doesn't seem like it." "I thought we'd have more time," Rose said, frustration and fear mingling in her voice. "How did he find us so quickly?" "Money talks," Zack replied grimly. "And Wallace seems to have plenty of it, probably paying for information all along the trail." Rose fell silent, her mind racing. She had hoped to reach Denver before Wallace caught up to them, to find safety with her cousin and her husband, perhaps even seek legal protection through the territorial courts. Now, it seemed they were barely staying one step ahead of him. "We need to change our plan," Zack said, as if reading her thoughts. "Main trail's too risky now, too many people who might recognize us or remember seeing us." "What do you suggest?" Rose asked, trusting his knowledge of the territory. Zack was quiet for a moment, considering. "There's a route through the high country. Adds a few days to the journey but keeps us away from settlements. It's rougher terrain, but that works in our favor. Wallace and his men are looking for easy traveling with a woman and baby. Can Thunder manage it, carrying all three of us?" "For a while," Zack replied. "But we'll need to acquire another horse soon. There's a ranch about a day's ride from here, good folks I've guided for in the past. They might be willing to sell us a mount." The decision made, they continued northwest, eventually rejoining the main trail as the boy had indicated. They followed it only briefly before Zack led them onto a less traveled path that angled toward the distant mountains. The terrain grew steadily more challenging as the day progressed, rolling hills giving way to steeper slopes dotted with pine and aspen. By late afternoon, Thunder was showing signs of fatigue, his pace slowing despite Zack's encouragement. "We'll make camp early tonight," Zack decided as they reached a small plateau with a view of the valley below. "Give Thunder a chance to rest properly. We've put enough distance between us and Miller's Crossing for now." The campsite was well chosen, sheltered by a rocky outcropping with a small spring providing fresh water. While Zack tended to Thunder and gathered firewood, Rose settled Emma on a blanket and prepared what food they had. "We should reach the Caldwell Ranch by tomorrow afternoon," Zack said as they ate their simple meal. "Scott Caldwell's a good man, helped him bring cattle up from Texas 3 years back. If anyone will sell us a horse without asking too many questions, it's him." "And if he can't, or won't?" Rose asked, voicing the concern that had been nagging at her. Zack met her gaze steadily. "Then we keep going as we are until we find someone who will. I'm not leaving you and Emma to face Wallace alone, Rose. Not now, not ever." The conviction in his voice sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of something deeper and more complex. In the short time they'd known each other, Zack Parker had become more than just her protector or traveling companion. He had become essential to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Thank you," she said softly, reaching across to touch his hand. "For everything?" Zack turned his palm upward, capturing her fingers in his. "No thanks needed, not between us." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. It was Zack who finally broke the contact, rising to check on Thunder. Rose watched him go, her hand still warm from his touch. That night, as they prepared for sleep, Zack insisted on taking first watch despite the long day of travel. "I'll wake you in a few hours," he promised as Rose settled beside Emma on their shared blanket. But when Rose woke to the first light of dawn, she found Zack still sitting by the fire, his rifle across his knees. He had let her sleep through the night. "You should have woken me," she scolded gently, moving to sit beside him. Zack shrugged, the shadows under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. You needed the rest more than I did. Besides, he added with a hint of his usual humor, you look too peaceful to disturb. Rose studied his tired face with concern. You can't keep going like this, Zach. You need sleep too. I'll rest when we reach the Caldwells, he promised. Once I know you and Emma are safe. Despite his fatigue, Zach insisted they break camp quickly and continue their journey. The path grew steeper as they ventured further into the foothills, requiring Thunder to work harder with each mile. Zach dismounted frequently, leading the horse on foot to spare him the double burden. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, and even Emma was growing fretful in the heat. They stopped in the shade of a large pine, giving Thunder a much-needed rest while Rose tended to her daughter. How much further to the ranch? Rose asked, wiping Emma's flushed face with a damp cloth. Another few hours, Zach replied, scanning the trail behind them. Should be there before sundown, barring any trouble. The mention of trouble sent Rose's gaze following his, searching for any sign of pursuit. Do you think Wallace could have followed us this far? Zach frowned, considering. Possible, but not likely. This trail isn't well known, and we've been careful to cover our tracks. He turned back to her, his expression softening. Try not to worry too much. We're ahead of him for now. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually opening into a broad valley nestled among the foothills. In the distance, Rose could make out fenced pastures and the outline of buildings, a substantial ranch operation spread across the fertile bottomland. The Caldwell place, Zach confirmed, pointing toward the structures. One of the largest spreads in this part of the territory. As they approached, Rose could see that the ranch was indeed impressive, a large main house built of squared logs, several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and a substantial barn. The sounds of activity carried on the breeze, hammering from what appeared to be a workshop, the lowing of cattle, and the barking of dogs announcing their arrival. A tall man emerged from the main house as they rode into the yard, wiping his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt. His weathered face broke into a grin of recognition as Zach dismounted. Well, I'll be damned, Zach Parker as I live and breathe. He strode forward, hand extended. What brings you to my doorstep, you old trail hound? Scott, Zach greeted, clasping the man's hand warmly. Good to see you. Been too long. That it has, Scott Caldwell agreed, his gaze moving curiously to Rose and Emma still mounted on Thunder. And who might these lovely ladies be? My wife, Rose, Zach replied smoothly, helping Rose dismount, and our daughter, Emma. Rose felt a flutter of surprise at the continued pretense, but managed a polite smile as Scott Caldwell turned his attention to her. Mrs. Parker, he said, tipping his hat respectfully. A pleasure to meet you, and this little beauty as well, he chuckled as Emma regarded him solemnly. Serious little thing, isn't she? Only with strangers, Rose replied, finding her voice. She's quite the chatterbox once she knows you. A woman appeared in the doorway of the house, petite with graying blonde hair and kind eyes. Scott, who's arrived? Mary, come meet Zach Parker and his family, Scott called. You remember Zach helped us bring that herd up from the Brazos a few years back. Mary Caldwell hurried down the porch steps, her face lighting with recognition. Of course I remember, the young man who saved Scott from that flash flood. She embraced Zach warmly before turning to Rose. And you must be Mrs. Parker. Welcome to our home. Thank you, Rose said, genuinely touched by the warm reception. It's lovely to meet you both. You must be exhausted from your journey, Mary observed, her experienced eye taking in their travel-worn appearance. Come inside. I've got stew simmering and fresh bread just out of the oven. Scott nodded in agreement. I'll have one of the boys see to your horse. Looks like he could use some grain and a good rub-down. Appreciate that, Zach said. Thunder's been carrying more than his fair share these past days. Inside, the Caldwell home was comfortable and welcoming, a large main room with a stone fireplace, solid wooden furniture softened by colorful quilts, and walls adorned with family portraits. The aroma of cooking filled the air, making Rose suddenly aware of how hungry she was. Mary insisted they freshen up before the meal, showing them to a guest room with a washstand already prepared with hot water. "Take your time," she said kindly. "Dinner won't be ready for another half hour." Left alone, Rose turned to Zach with a questioning look. "Your wife?" Zach had the grace to look slightly abashed. Seemed simpler than explaining our actual situation. The Caldwells are good people, but they might feel obligated to report a woman fleeing with her child if they knew the truth. Rose sighed, understanding his reasoning even as she felt uncomfortable with the deception. "I suppose you're right, but I don't like lying to people who are being so kind to us. We'll tell them as much of the truth as we safely can," Zach promised. "Just not the parts that might put them or us at risk." The meal was everything Mary had promised: hearty beef stew, crusty bread still warm from the oven, fresh butter, and a wild berry cobbler for dessert. The Caldwells proved to be gracious hosts and engaging conversationalists, sharing news of the territory and stories of their ranch without prying too deeply into their guests' business. After dinner, when Mary had taken Emma to show her a handmade quilt she thought the baby might enjoy, Zach finally broached the purpose of their visit. "Scott, I need to ask a favor," he began, his tone serious. "We're traveling to Denver, and Thunder's been carrying double for too long. I'm looking to buy a horse something steady and trail-worthy." Scott studied him thoughtfully. "Any particular reason for the urgency? Denver's not going anywhere." Zach hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth. "We've had some trouble following us." "Nothing Rose and Emma need to be involved in," understanding dawned in Scott's eyes. "Someone from your past, from the war, something like that," Zach allowed, grateful for the rancher's perceptiveness. "The less said the better for your sake as well as ours." Scott nodded slowly. "I understand, and I've got just the mount for you. Mare named Willow, 7 years old, calm disposition but with plenty of stamina. Good with inexperienced riders too, which might be important for your wife." "Sounds perfect," Zach said, relief evident in his voice. "What are you asking for her?" They negotiated a fair price, with Scott throwing in a used saddle and tack as part of the deal. "Consider it a wedding gift," he insisted when Zach tried to pay extra. "Bit late, perhaps, but sincere nonetheless." Guilt flickered across Zach's face at the continued deception, but he accepted the generosity with thanks. Later, when they were alone in the guest room preparing for sleep, he confessed his discomfort to Rose. "Don't like lying to a good man like Scott," he admitted. "Feels wrong, taking advantage of his kindness. We'll find a way to repay him someday," Rose promised, settling Emma in the small trundle bed Mary had provided. "When all this is behind us." Zach nodded, his expression softening as he watched Rose tuck the blanket around her sleeping daughter. "You're a good woman, Rose Sullivan, too good for the hand life's dealt you." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "I don't know about that. Some parts of this journey have been unexpectedly precious." The admission hung between them, laden with meaning. Zach took a step toward her, then hesitated. "Rose," A soft knock at the door interrupted whatever he had been about to say. It was Mary, bringing extra blankets and a pitcher of fresh water. "Thought you might need these," she said, setting the items on a nearby table. "Nights get cool up here even in summer." "Thank you," Rose replied, grateful for both the thoughtfulness and the distraction from the moment's intensity. "You've been so kind." Mary smiled, her eyes moving between Rose and Zach with knowing warmth. "It's nice to have young folks around. Our own children are grown and gone, 2 boys working their own spreads in Montana, and our daughter married to a merchant in San Francisco." She sighed. "Miss them something fierce, especially the grandchildren." After Mary left, the moment between Rose and Zach had passed, replaced by a comfortable if slightly awkward companionship as they prepared for sleep. The bed was larger than the one at the inn, allowing them to maintain a respectful distance while sharing the mattress. Rose lay awake for some time, listening to Zach's steady breathing beside her and Emma's softer sounds from the trundle bed. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to think beyond their immediate journey beyond Denver and safety with her cousin. What future could she build for herself and Emma? The ranch in Wyoming was legally her daughter's inheritance, but returning there meant facing Wallace again. Staying in Denver meant depending on her cousin's charity, at least initially. Neither prospect filled her with joy. And then there was Zach, this surprising man who had become so important to her in such a short time. What place could he have in their future? He had his own ghosts to confront in Laramie, his own path to follow. The thought of parting ways with him left an ache in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Morning came with the cheerful sounds of a working ranch rooster's crowing, cattle lowing, and the clatter of activity from the kitchen where Mary was already preparing breakfast. Rose woke to find Zach gone from the bed, though his saddlebags remained in the corner. She dressed quickly and saw to Emma's needs before joining the household in the main room. Zach was already there, deep in conversation with Scott over coffee at the large oak table. "Morning, sleepyhead," he greeted with a warm smile. "Thought we'd let you rest a bit longer. You and Emma seemed peaceful." "I didn't mean to oversleep," Rose apologized, accepting the cup of coffee Mary offered. "Nonsense," the older woman said firmly. "You needed the rest, dear." Traveling with a little one is exhausting in the best of circumstances. Breakfast was a hearty affair of flapjacks, eggs, and bacon, with fresh milk for Emma, who accepted this novel treat with enthusiasm. Afterward, Scott took Zach to the corral to see Willow, while Mary invited Rose to help gather vegetables from the kitchen garden. "How long have you and Zach been married?" Mary asked conversationally as they picked green beans in the morning sunshine. Rose hesitated, caught between truth and the continuing pretense. "Not very long," she replied carefully. "It's all still quite new." Mary smiled, her eyes knowing. "I thought as much. You have that look about you, still finding your way together." She paused in her work, studying Rose with gentle perception. "He's a good man, Zach Parker. Scott thinks the world of him." "Yes," Rose agreed softly, "he is a good man. And whatever trouble you're running from," Mary continued quietly, "I hope you find peace soon." Rose looked up sharply, but there was no accusation in the older woman's face, only understanding and compassion. "How did you know?" Mary resumed her picking, her voice matter of fact. "Been around long enough to recognize the signs, the way you both watch the trail." The tension in Zach's shoulders, the fear that comes into your eyes sometimes when you look at your daughter. She shrugged. "Don't need to know the details. Just want you to know you're safe here for as long as you need to be." Tears pricked at Rose's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than I can say." They returned to the house with their harvest to find Zach and Scott in the yard with a beautiful dappled gray mare. The horse was indeed, as Scott had described, steady and calm, watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes.